For over 400 years, the economy and culture of Gloucester and its surrounding communities on Cape Ann have been largely defined by the maritime industry. In the first half of the 20th century, a confluence of seminal events made Gloucester the center of global attention. During World War II, the rise of immigrant populations, coupled with innovations in shipbuilding design and manufacturing to meet fast-growing consumer markets, made Gloucester the most invaluable fishing port in the free world. One surviving vessel from this era exemplifies the evolution of our working waterfront. I'm Corey Kukuru for 1623 Studios, and this is the story of Gloucester's fishing heyday, featuring the Evelina M Goulart. The story begins with swordfish. One of the fastest and most aggressive predators in the ocean, swordfish can grow to be over 14 feet long, 1,200 pounds, and swim up to 50 miles per hour. They migrate alone through cold and tropical waters, using long, pointy bills that extend off their upper jawbone to slash at prey. Their extraordinary strength is legendary and continues to baffle oceanographers and marine biologists. Swordfishing traces back more than 2,000 years. Ancient Iberian and Mediterranean fishermen, guided by lookouts, speared swordfish from their boats, letting the wounded fish tire before hauling it ashore. Centuries later, this primitive and highly dangerous method closely resembled practices adopted here in New England. Gloucester, essentially an island in the northeast corner of Massachusetts, was established in 1623 as a farming and trading community. With its deep harbor, the settlement soon developed a fishing industry. Many of the fishing vessels were built in the nearby town of Essex, the area's historic shipbuilding center, whose legacy included the simple, rugged tobacco boats of the colonial era, which allowed people to stand while they fished in shallow waters, to the famous racing yachts of the early 20th century. Transatlantic shipping and slave trade routes were established from the 1500s to the 1800s, mostly via merchant vessels powered by sails. Toward the end of this era, the majority of cargo and passengers were transported by steam-powered vessels. One type in particular gained popularity amongst traders and fishermen: the schooner. Schooners are defined by having two or more masts that hold gaff-rigged sails which have four corners, are controlled at their peaks, and are more suitable for heavy weather and long sea passages. The term is from the Scottish word schoon, meaning to skip along the water like a stone. When you think of a schooner, you may envision the majestic yachts that competed in the early years of the America's Cup. But schooners became more and more prevalent amongst competing fishing fleets in the North Atlantic. They were sleeker, faster, and required less crew than its predecessors, allowing captains to circumnavigate further distances. During these cross-Atlantic expeditions, mariners often stopped at ports in the Azores, a convenient Portuguese archipelago consisting of 9 volcanic islands about 1,000 miles west of its mainland. There, captains and commanders stocked up on oranges to fight scurvy and hired experienced crewmen. Over time, this built strong bonds between the Azorian and Western Atlantic fleets of Canada and New England, specifically on Cape Cod and Cape Ann. Many of the vessels that stopped in the Azores sailed from New York, Boston, or America's first seaport, Gloucester. Azorian fishermen were revered for their skill and fearlessness, especially as whale hunters, when whale oil was a main ingredient for light and methods of lubrication. But the discovery of crude oil cratered the whaling industry, so Azorian whalers came to New England to fish and prosper. Before the Civil War, salted swordfish was sold to the southern states and Caribbean as slave provisions. The first record of a swordfish brought to Gloucester was in 1831, yet after the Civil War, only one Gloucester vessel swordfished. It was near cities with growing Portuguese populations like New Bedford, Fall River, and Providence where fresh swordfish markets emerged. Most swordfish were sold there too, where demand and prices were higher than anywhere else. Naturally, as fresh swordfish prices soared, so did the number of vessels engaged in summertime sword fishing trips when the highly migratory species reached the North Atlantic. It was just a matter of time before Gloucester's Portuguese population became a pivotal part of this developing market. Gloucester had one of the largest Portuguese communities in the United States, composed mainly of 200 Azorian fishing families. Most of them settled within a 2,000-foot-long tract of land overlooking Gloucester's inner harbor that affectionately became known as Portuguese or Portuguese Hill. The heartbeat of the neighborhood was Our Lady of Good Voyage Church, a national parish that offered services in their native language. Our Lady was built in 1889 at the foot of the hill to minister the city's growing Portuguese population and protectively watch over the fishing fleet. A quick side story. The church was destroyed by fire in the winter of 1914, but the community rallied. With the generosity of people like Abram Andrew Jr., a resident and former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, a new Our Lady of Good Voyage Church was built in only 15 months. Featuring 2 identical bell towers, it was modeled after the mission-styled Santa Maria Maddalena Church on the Azorian island of Pico. Andrew also commissioned a Portuguese artist to hand-carve a 10-foot-tall statue of the Virgin Mary, the patron saint of sailors, which he donated to the church. After World War I, Andrew, by then a congressman, saw to it that 25 carillon bells be shipped to Gloucester from England's John Taylor and Company Bell Foundry, the same company that forged the Liberty Bell. Andrew convinced Congress that the bell should be deemed a work of art, thereby waiving a 35% tariff on musical instruments. A bill was signed by President Warren Harding in 1922. The carillon at Our Lady's was the very first in the United States. Upon visiting Gloucester to hear the bells toll, John Rockefeller Jr. donated $500 to add 6 more. Andrew, incidentally, is better known locally as A. Pyatt Andrew, for whom the arching bridge connecting the majority of Gloucester to mainland Massachusetts is named. Back to Portuguese Hill. The immigrant fishermen grew up as part of Portugal's reputable fleet that routinely chased cod, or bacalhau, from dories. Dories are small, maneuverable rowboats about 15 to 20 feet long that were stacked on larger vessels with steam-powered engines. Dories were lowered into the water, each manned by 1 or 2 fishermen who rowed sometimes miles from the main vessel to catch or retrieve fish with hand lines, harpoons, and small nets. After hauling fish aboard, the dories returned and were hoisted back onto the main vessel. Though it was the standard method of the day, dory fishing was incredibly treacherous. Azorian fishermen traditionally fished from single-man dories as opposed to the customary 2-man dories on American vessels. With such expertise, many Portuguese were considered the best dorymen in the North Atlantic, and perhaps the craziest. At the dawn of the 20th century, Gloucester boasted a large summer sword fishing fleet. Most vessels were owned and operated by Portuguese fishermen who boosted the newfound sword fishing industry. By the 1920s, more than a dozen vessels were bringing in thousands of swordfish per week. As the industry evolved, innovations in shipbuilding and refrigeration brought seismic changes to Gloucester's working waterfront. The popularity of swordfish among consumers surged further with the introduction of ice and refrigerated transportation. This allowed fresh swordfish to be distributed far beyond the seaports where the catches were landed. Schooners were now being built with hulls designed to function like larger vessels. They were fitted with specific equipment that dragged cone-shaped nets underwater to catch more fish, known as otter trawlers. Otter boards, or doors as fishermen called them, stretch open the mouths of fishing nets, or trawls. These diesel-powered wooden vessels called draggers were safer, cleaner, and more affordable than vessels fueled by coal-fired steam engines. Pricey, steam-powered trawlers placed drag fishing in the hands of corporations with wealthy backers. But diesel-powered trawlers leveled the field by eliminating the reliance on dories. This meant individuals could own vessels outright and fish with smaller crews. allowing local fishermen to maintain independence amidst growing corporate influence. Throughout the first half of the 1900s, schooners built for drag fishing flourished. One of those successful schooner captains was Manuel Goulart. With decades of experience under his belt, Goulart, an Azorian native, had the Evelina M Goulart schooner built at the A.D. Story shipyard on the Essex River. Named after Manuel's wife, the Evelina Goulart was christened by their young daughter Evelina and launched in 1925. It measured 72 feet long by 20 feet wide. Captain Goulart fished for 2 seasons but felt the vessel was too small, so he commissioned a larger vessel, the Evelina M Goulart, which measured 84 feet by 21 feet, large enough to fit a crew of 10 and hold over 100,000 pounds of fish. The vessel was outfitted with a 6-cylinder, 200-horsepower Cooper Bessemer engine, a rugged, slow-speed power plant intended for grueling, strenuous workloads. Here's where schooners built for fishing were such a departure from schooners built for show. The romanticized racing schooners that wowed the public from ashore were like thoroughbred horses, extravagant, unprofitable showpieces. Schooners built to fish were more like work mules that prioritized functionality and efficiency over aesthetics. This era was about economic survival rather than the pursuit of beauty. In its first season, the Evelina Goulart set records for most swordfish landed. However, the swordfishing catch across the entire fleet plummeted. But it wasn't for a lack of fish. It was that another species, and a genius method for the way people would consume it around the world, changed the fishing industry and the landscape of Gloucester Harbor forever. Clarence Birdseye was a college-age employee of the U.S. Department of Agriculture on a long-term assignment in the desolate region of Labrador in northeast Canada. Labrador's indigenous peoples showed Birdseye how they ice fished to survive the severe winter months. When fish were reeled by hand to the surface and exposed to air, they froze instantly. But when thawed, the fish still tasted fresh. In 1922, Birdseye pioneered a method of quick freezing and packaging haddock fillets, replacing the traditional process of shipping whole codfish for salting and later filleting. Haddock fillets are thinner and more delicate than cod, thus making them easier to freeze and transport. Operating in Gloucester, Birdseye's innovation led to the rise of the General Seafood Corporation, which later became General Foods and Birdseye Frosted Foods. The shift from salted cod to frozen haddock fillets established frozen fresh fish as the new market standard. Within 5 years, the amount of haddock caught in the region skyrocketed from 74 million pounds to nearly 200 million. As the national market for haddock grew, fishing methods matured, prompting adjustments in vessel design and equipment. New England's fishing force struggled to meet demand. Companies raced to enlarge fleets, recondition old vessels, and convert draggers to pursue lucrative haddock. More vessels adopted trawl nets to take advantage of the ever-growing frozen fish packaging operations. New records for landings were set seemingly every day. The sole purpose of vessels such as the Goulart was to catch fish and make money for its owners and crew. Into the 1930s, the Goulart and other predominantly Portuguese draggers caught haddock in the spring and fall, then swordfish in the summer. Though swordfish season only lasted a few months, it was more profitable than dragging for haddock. In the winter, the Goulart and a handful of other Gloucester vessels worked out of New York City's Fulton Fish Market, fishing in the warmer, safer waters of the mid-Atlantic. Sometimes this meant temporarily uprooting entire families from Gloucester to Brooklyn from Christmas until spring. Towards the end of spring, the Goulart was hauled ashore at Parkhurst Railway in Gloucester to be fitted out for the swordfishing season. The ritual included removing the pilot house and stripping all of the dragging gear, such as nets, winches, gallows frames, and trawl doors. Swordfishing trips usually lasted 2 to 3 weeks. Throughout the summer, fishermen followed a 100-fathom curve, meaning a long stretch of ocean of similar depth, eventually reaching the tempestuous Grand Banks fishing grounds off Nova Scotia, some 1,200 miles from home. When fish were there, the high-powered vessels lumbered from hotspot to hotspot. When fish weren't, sails were hoisted for stabilization and jogged or cruised with low or no engine power. If there were ever any downtime, familiar vessels sidled up to one another so crews could gam or shoot the breeze, exchanging news, gossip, and directions to hotspots. Crews also did a fair amount of gamming with their Canadian counterparts for a little hush-hush trade. Back then, there wasn't a lot of policing in international waters. Americans bought swordfish livers from Canadian vessels and sold them in Boston for a rate many times higher than what the Canadians could get back home. The livers were used to make popular high-grade vitamin A pills that were thought to reduce the mortality of respiratory illnesses, measles, and other infections. Americans also traded cigarettes to Canadians for whiskey or cash. Sword fishermen had their own unique customs, language, and superstitions too. One of the Goulart's crewmen, Teotonio Lopes, always carried a pouch of rosary beads in his pocket. Crew members even clashed over the kind of food brought on board. The old-timers amongst many Portuguese vessels only wanted to eat fish and potatoes, as had always been tradition, probably because they were the easiest and cheapest provisions to stock. But younger crewmen, and the Canadian crews the local fleets often intermingled with, preferred meat and chicken. Think of it, just as ocean-fresh seafood was becoming popular in places far from the coastlines, so too were different types of beef and poultry being transported from inland to seafaring communities. The old-timers thought having chicken or gallina on board was bad luck. When the last catch the crews could handle was finally hauled on board, to the point where hulls literally bulged, the Portuguese vessels gathered before leaving the fishing grounds to form a circle in a sign of solidarity, and to wish each other luck on their journey home. The Goulart gained renown for record-setting feats in sword fishing that led to big paychecks. But make no mistake, this was back-breaking work. Though sword fishing was less physically taxing than drag fishing, fishermen were always at risk due to the aggressive nature of the species. Trips were often characterized by heart-stopping pursuits and horrific injuries. In fact, during the short downtime home between trips, fishermen used those precious hours to catch up on sleep and lick their wounds. Bad falls, injuries from equipment, and burns were commonplace, not to mention awful weather events, unpredictable seas, and debilitating illnesses. To protect their eyes from sun damage, some wore long-brimmed baseball caps with ear flaps and used borax or tea solution for rinsing. They even rubbed soot from the galley stack under their eyes to reduce glare and wore pale lipstick to prevent sunburnt lips. Every outing invited trauma. Masthead men were always in peril. Responsible for spotting swordfish, maintaining rigging, and inspecting sails, they climbed up to 75 feet to the tops of masts without any type of safety gear. It was one hand on the mast and one hand for yourself. There are many accounts of men falling from impossible heights or being electrocuted during lightning storms. In extreme cases, thrashing swordfish known as punchers pierced the hulls of dories and schooners with their razor-sharp bills. In one well-told tale from the 19th century, Captain Frank Langsford of Lanesville and a dory mate were retrieving a 300-pound swordfish that Langsford harpooned from his schooner Venus, about 8 miles off Halibut Point. As they reeled the harpoon line, the wounded fish spun and surged upward. The sudden slack in the harpoon line felled Langsford. The sword thrust through the dory and impaled Langsford through his tailbone. Adrenalized and unaware he was badly injured, Langsford lifted himself up and held onto the sword so it wouldn't get away until the schooner reached the dory. Captain Langsford was helped on board, then collapsed. He died 3 days later. When word got around the docks, crews started affixing thick metal plates to the bottom of dories for protection. Fishing for a living is a feast or famine existence, and Gloucester struggled exceptionally throughout the Great Depression. Nearly 3/4 of the city's population was tied to the fishing industry. For a decade, the haddock stock nosedived. Not only was haddock overfished, but salted fish had lost its popularity, and you could only transport fresh fish a relatively short distance, making it economically unviable. Fierce foreign competition also put a big dent in the consumer market. Several businesses along the waterfront were shuttered. When word got out that any business was hiring, hundreds of unemployed men gathered and waited along the wharves in hopes of being chosen to make a day's pay. Once again, those in the fishing industry used their guile to make necessary adjustments. To stem the economic disaster, fishermen focused on an abundant species with a promising outlook that was much closer to home: Acadian redfish. Historically, redfish was considered a trash fish, meaning it was thought to be inedible or have no value. But with trawl nets, redfish were being caught hand over fist in the nearby Gulf of Maine. It could also be served and preserved in a variety of ways. To appeal to the masses, and to not confuse this species with other breeds of redfish in the Gulf of Mexico or the Pacific, Acadian redfish was marketed by its more consumer-friendly alias, ocean perch. Gloucester's surplus of vacant buildings, unused vessels, and out-of-work fishermen made it the perfect spot to rapidly develop the ocean perch fishery. The local economy did a 180. Just before World War II, redfish landings ballooned fourfold to 100 million pounds. Gloucester surpassed Boston as the world's leading fishing port. Accordingly, vessels like the Goulart responded to the market shift and set their sights on ocean perch. They scooped the fish by dragging nets made of sisal or tarred cotton. Yanking nets across the rough ocean floor led to constant upkeep, so every vessel had twine men dedicated to repair nets. Dozens of fishing families and neighborhood kids also repaired nets when the fishermen were in. Actually, it's hard to express just how many people here were involved in the fishing industry. There was a job on the wharves if you wanted one: packing fish, canning fish, descaling fish, icing fish, delivering fish, smoking fish, selling fish, marketing fish, studying fish, not to mention all the ancillary industries that maintain the fleet: riggers, caulkers, painters, machinists, mechanics, oilskin manufacturers. The list of shops and jobs goes on and on. Everyone who lived here was connected to the working waterfront. One of the most important jobs on the wharves was that of the lumper. Lumpers were on-call day laborers who unloaded fish the moment a vessel reached a dock. They also cleaned and sanitized the holds and refilled them with ice for the next trip. Some turnarounds for fishing trips happened within the same day, so not only did lumpers work non-stop to remove and sort through hundreds of thousands of pounds of seafood in one shift, they allowed crewmen valuable time off. Ask the families of fishermen how often they're home. In more than 10,000 instances in Gloucester alone, fishermen didn't come home at all. When the United States entered World War II, the demand for fresh fish increased to even more staggering levels for a number of reasons. There was a massive meat shortage throughout the country. There were also food requirements for U.S. Armed Forces and food commitments to our allies. Gloucester's total catch in pounds increased from 96 million in 1940 to nearly 215 million in 1945. That's nearly 1 billion pounds, or almost 4% of all the fish caught in the United States. The fishing fleet accomplished this despite having 20% of its vessel tonnage, or amount of cargo, requisitioned or set aside for the federal government. In the summer wartime months, the Goulart was a true highliner, a vessel that consistently returned with massive catches. The government also summoned the strongest vessels of Gloucester's fleet to aid in the war effort. The country was desperate to patrol the Atlantic coast to deter German U-boats from setting mines in American waters. There was ugly history here. During the First World War, German submarines sank 18 fishing vessels from Gloucester and Boston. But fishing schooners had that one distinct advantage. They could operate with their engines off, using only their sails to jog along the water top at a few knots. If captains wanted to stay in place, they would hove to or point their bows into the wind. Schooners were a big problem for German submarines because U-boats relied on warning impulses from the vibrating propellers of approaching vessels. The largest Gloucester draggers capable of supporting depth charges, explosives that could be dropped from a vessel and detonate underwater at a preset depth, were either sold, leased to, or confiscated by the Navy. This is the Babe Sears, one of the Portuguese fleet vessels that, like the Goulart, was built at the Dory shipyard in Essex. It was taken by the Navy and fitted as a coastal patrol craft. Vessels not confiscated by the Navy acted as specially equipped volunteer observers. The Goulart was part of Gloucester's volunteer U-boat spotting fleet. It continued to fish and wasn't altered in any way. Her role was to report any submarines to the Coast Guard by transmitting coded messages via shortwave radio. The Coast Guard then warned all vessels in that area. The Germans, knowing they had been exposed, were forced to move further out to sea and remain below the surface to avoid detection. The maritime wartime effort of the local fleet was extremely dicey. Germans targeted unarmed fishing vessels, robbing them of fuel and supplies. On June 3, 1942, two Gloucester draggers in the Gulf of Maine, the Ben and Josephine, as well as the Aeolus, were trailed by a German submarine that surfaced and fired warning shots. Both incidents were only hours apart. Each crew was ordered off their vessel and into their dories under a hail of gunfire. Remarkably, in each case, the German U-boat commanders allowed the fishermen to row away before shelling and sinking the vessels. Unable to radio the Coast Guard, the crews rowed for 36 hours until they reached the Mount Desert Rock Lighthouse Station off the coast of Maine. On June 15, 1944, the Boston trawler Lark was attacked. Its captain, James Abbott of Gloucester, took cover behind the pilot house to avoid being hit by 2,000 rounds of small ammunition. The Lark was able to limp back to port. After the war, the vessels used by the Navy were returned to their owners, having received commendations or citations for bravery and service to the nation. The rebounding fishing industry, buoyed by the war effort, encapsulated a golden age for fishing family neighborhoods like Portuguese Hill. Like other tight-knit immigrant enclaves on Cape Ann, the Hill was a community that looked after its own. Families left doors unlocked, grew much of their own food, raised their own livestock, and shared everything with their neighbors. Salted fish was hung to dry in basements, and the sense of fruits and vegetables being preserved filled the air. This sustained everyone during winter when most of the fishing fleet either stayed in or temporarily relocated to warmer climates. Many homes were heated by coal, so kids walked along railroad tracks to pick up stray lumps that had fallen from cars. It was a good time to be a kid on Portuguese Hill. You had dozens of de facto moms who kept an eye on you. There were 3 schools and, not coincidentally, 15 penny candy shops. Then there were daily visits from the ice cream man, the bread man, the milk man, the fruit man, any of whom could always give you a lift down the hill to the new movie theater on Main Street. For fishing families and their neighborhoods, this was their version of the American dream. It wasn't an easy life, but the opportunity for a better life if you worked for it. And at the roots of that life were the family-owned fishing vessels that provided for everyone. And this story cannot be told without mentioning just how important women were throughout this era. With fathers, sons, and brothers gone for weeks at a time at sea, and hundreds more who served in the military, it was the women of Cape Ann who became the factory workers, welders, and shipbuilders. They volunteered for the Red Cross and USO. It was the women left behind who stepped up to raise their families, tend to the fishing industry, and keep the neighborhoods intact. After World War II, Manuel Goulart retired and sold his shares in the Goulart to acting captain Manuel Carriço, along with crew members Teotonio Lopes, John Lopes, Agostino da Silva, and local marina owner Frank Alexander. Transactions like this were common practice. Vessel ownership was often divided by multiple shares, and crewmen often had a piece. Carriço, with previous experience as skipper and partial owner of the Goulart since 1945, became the principal owner. By the early 1950s, large vessels like the Goulart became too expensive to operate and turn a profit sword fishing, so they shifted to drag fishing permanently. Additionally, the redfish stock in the Grand Banks was seriously depleted and moving northward. Fishermen were traveling much further to catch less fish. It was a scary proposition. Fewer young men with families were willing to risk a life at sea for such long stretches. Gloucester also lost its grip as the fish processing hub when technological innovations made the practice possible not just in major ports, but anywhere. Consumer tastes and preferences changed too. Lastly, Canadian fisheries in Labrador and Newfoundland bought several of Gloucester's major vessels, which made sense as they were much closer to the fishing grounds. All of these factors contributed to the end of the most productive era of the local fishing industry. And it was obvious to those whose livelihoods depended on it that their world would never be the same. Captain Manuel Carrizo retired in 1977. The family sold their Gloucester property and moved to New Bedford, where the Goulart continued fishing under new ownership. During Hurricane Gloria, a powerful storm in September of 1985, the Goulart was struck in the stern by another vessel that had gone adrift in New Bedford Harbor. The crew managed to get the Goulart back to the dock, but its fishing career was over. She was decommissioned and slowly settled in shallow mud while the owners decided what to do with her. It became a hazard to navigation and was scheduled to be demolished when a captain in Martha's Vineyard named Bob Douglas contacted the Essex Shipbuilding Museum about rescuing her. In 1989, Douglas hired a diver to inspect the vessel. At his own expense, Douglas raised and hauled out the Goulart. She was patched and caulked several times while the town of Essex hotly debated whether the vessel should be hauled ashore, and if so, where. It was finally agreed at a town meeting to bring the Goulart to the public town landing, which happens to be adjacent to the old Story shipyard where it was built. Hundreds of volunteers helped transport the Goulart from New Bedford Harbor to the Essex River and haul her out for conservation work. She was kept there on blocks for 5 years. In the meantime, the Essex Shipbuilding Museum acquired the Story shipyard, where the Goulart was resettled. It now rests as an historic exhibit. One of the last schooner/fishing draggers of its kind, just a few hundred yards from where she was built by hand and launched in 1927. So of all the important vessels during the industry's golden age, why focus on the Evelina Goulart? Well, she stands as a remarkable example of a transitional schooner crafted during the 1920s and 30s that blended elements of sail and power. Unfortunately, there is very little documentation about these transitional vessels. Today, one can visit the Essex Historical Society and Shipbuilding Museum, which serves as a center for education and preservation. There, you can get an up-close and personal look at the Evelina M Goulart. The permanent Goulart Gallery at the museum's Orientation Center has an extensive array of plans, photographs, and artifacts. Everything from a scalable vessel model to crew member Teotonio Lopes' rosary beads. This is why the Evelina Goulart's housing at the shipyard in which she was built is such a significant piece of maritime history. The Goulart and Carrizo families kept her meticulously maintained, so much of the original 1927 construction is preserved. This has given researchers invaluable insights into the evolution of traditional American fishing schooners and their transition from sail to power vessels during the interwar period. Its resting place at the Essex Shipbuilding Museum is more than a tribute to a single vessel. It's a living testament to the ingenuity and dedication of generations of fishermen and their families, offering a last chance to study the construction methods of working schooners before that knowledge is lost to history. Our fishing industry is far from its glory days. Gentrification plus decades of regulations and restrictions have taken their toll. Yes, the working waterfront is quieter, but it's still working. Vessels are serviced at the railways, Schooners are skimming across the harbors and waterways, and a smaller but equally devoted fishing fleet is still feeding the community. Thousands of stories like that of the Goulart need to be told and retold to remind us of the enduring bond between Cape Ann and the sea.